The Galactic Geological Survey prided itself on sending only the most qualified, most prepared, and most utterly convinced of their own competence survey teams to catalogue planetary resources across the known systems. Which was precisely why nobody had bothered to check the weather patterns on Taurith 9 beyond a cursory glance at the data that read, mostly temperate, occasional precipitation. Occasional. What a delightfully vague word that would come back to haunt them. The survey team had been on planet for 6 standard days, camped in what their orbital scans had assured them was a stable geological depression with adequate drainage. In less technical terms, they'd pitched their operation in a valley next to a river. The insectoid team leader, Vex Kali, had selected the location personally, her compound eyes scanning the terrain with the confidence of someone who'd done this 40 times before on 40 different worlds. The human logistics coordinator, a man named Thurmond, who seemed perpetually underdressed for every environment, had looked at the riverbank, looked at the sky, looked at his datapad, and said absolutely nothing. This should have been everyone's first warning. Poinal, the amphibious xenobiologist, whose species originated from a moon that was 90% ocean, had actually suggested moving to higher ground. The irony of the water breather being the only one concerned about flooding would be apparent later. Much later, when everyone was wet. Kosh, their avian navigator, whose hollow bones made him the lightest member of the expedition, and therefore the most weight-conscious about supply loads, had simply wanted to set up camp quickly and stop carrying things. His people had evolved from predatory birds on a high-gravity world, which meant his ancestors had learned to minimize energy expenditure with the dedication of accountants. Carrying geological survey equipment up a hill, inefficient. Setting up camp in the valley, logical. Drowning. Well, nobody plans for drowning. The camp itself was a modest affair, 4 environmental pods arranged in a semicircle, a central equipment cache protected by weather shielding that was rated for normal planetary conditions, 3 mobile analysis stations, and enough preserved rations to feed a multi-species crew for 30 days. The food processors hummed contentedly, breaking down the various species-specific nutritional requirements into edible formats. Vex Kali's people needed high-protein compounds with specific mineral content. Poinal required hydration supplements and algae-based nutrients. Kosh metabolism demanded high-calorie density foods. Thurmond ate something called trail mix from a plastic bag, and occasionally cooked dehydrated meals that smelled aggressively of artificial flavoring. On the 7th day, the sky developed opinions. The morning started pleasant enough, with Taurith 9's pale sun filtering through the atmosphere in that watery way that suggested photons were just passing through rather than actually illuminating anything. By midday, clouds had begun accumulating on the horizon with the ominous determination of collectors at an estate sale. Vex Kali consulted the meteorological data, her antenna twitching in what might have been concern or might have been a shrug. The readout suggested elevated precipitation probability. Elevated. Another wonderful word. We should secure the equipment, Poinel suggested, his gills fluttering nervously as he watched the darkening sky. His species had an instinctive understanding of water systems that came from living in them for millions of years. When a water breather gets nervous about water, everyone should pay attention. The weather shielding is rated for storms. Vex Kali clicked, mandibles working in dismissal. We're scheduled to collect samples from the Western Ridge Formation tomorrow. I'd prefer not to waste time on excessive precautions. Thurmond was checking his personal pack, that battered canvas monstrosity he carried everywhere, despite having access to perfectly good standard-issue equipment containers. He pulled out a compact weather radio, frowned at it, then looked upstream where the river bent around a rocky outcropping. The water level seemed normal. The color seemed normal. Everything seemed normal, except for Thurman's expression, which had shifted from his usual affable blankness to something approaching concern. "How fast does water move on this planet?" he asked, still watching the river. "Approximately standard gravitational expectations," Crutch replied, preening his secondary feathers with the disinterest of someone who'd stopped listening 3 words into the question. "Why would it matter? Just wondering how much time we'd have." "Time for what?" Thurmond didn't answer, because the first drops of rain had started falling. Not the gentle introducing myself patter of civilized precipitation, but the aggressive business hammering of water that had places to be and surfaces to saturate. Within minutes, the rain intensified from concerning to aggressive to genuinely hostile. The environmental pods deployed their weather seals automatically, which would have been comforting if everyone wasn't outside securing equipment. The river, as rivers do when presented with massive quantities of water upstream, began to express its feelings through interpretive rising. What had been a peaceful waterway 30 meters from their camp started creeping closer with each passing minute. Poynell's gills were practically vibrating with alarm now. "That's moving faster than standard gravitational expectations," he shouted over the increasing roar of wind and water. "Impossible," Vex-Kali clicked, but her compound eyes were tracking the water's advance with the dawning realization that planetary physics didn't care about her confidence level. "The drainage in this valley should." "The drainage probably works great when it's not the rainy season," Thurmond interrupted, which was unusual because Thurmond rarely interrupted anyone. He was already moving toward the equipment cache, his movements efficient and unhurried despite the chaos. "We need to move to higher ground. Now. We can't relocate the entire camp in this weather," Crutch shrieked, his feathers plastered to his body in a way that made him look half his normal size and twice as panicked. "The equipment alone would require." The river answered by surging over its banks with the enthusiasm of water that had been confined for far too long, and was done with boundaries. "Thank you very much." The first wave hit the equipment cache with enough force to trigger the weather shielding's emergency protocols, which promptly failed because weather shielding was designed for weather coming from above, not water coming from the side at high velocity. What followed was chaos with a specific flavor known only to people watching their carefully organized supplies achieve unwanted mobility. The food processors, those essential pieces of technology that stood between the crew and starvation, took on water with the grace of bricks learning to swim. Analysis stations tumbled. Storage containers performed unwanted flotation tests. Vex-Kali's emergency communicator, which she'd left charging in her pod, sparked once and died with what could only be described as electronic resignation. "Higher ground." Thurman's voice cut through the confusion with the authority of someone who'd stopped suggesting and started commanding. He grabbed Crutch bodily, which was only possible because Crutch's hollow bones made him weigh approximately as much as a large houseplant, and started moving uphill. Poynell needed no encouragement, his amphibious nature making him perfectly comfortable in water, but also perfectly aware of what flash floods could do. Vex-Kali hesitated, torn between her equipment and her survival instincts, before her instincts won, and she skittered after them on her 6 legs. They regrouped on a rocky outcropping about 40 meters above the valley floor, watching as Taurith 9's river system demonstrated why choosing campsites based solely on convenience was a poor life strategy. The water wasn't just rising, it was expanding, claiming territory with the manifest destiny of liquid finding its level. Their pods, designed to be stable and sturdy, proved to be neither when confronted with actual river currents. Two of them tipped over, one began drifting. The fourth somehow wedged itself against a rock and held position through sheer structural stubbornness. Emergency extraction, Vex Kali announced, her voice having lost all its earlier confidence and gained several notes of defeated acceptance. We'll signal for pickup, salvage what we can when the water recedes. And what? Scrooge interrupted, his voice climbing into registers that might have been words or might have been just pure avian distress. Our communicator is underwater. Our emergency beacon was in the equipment cache, which is currently achieving aquatic velocity. The backup beacon was in my pod. Poynal finished quietly, pointing at the pod that was currently performing its impromptu river journey. They stood in the rain, a collection of highly trained specialists watching their mission devolve into an expensive disaster. The silence was broken only by the roar of water and the sound of Scrooge's quiet, mournful chirping. Even the rain seemed to be mocking them, having shifted from torrential to steady, as if the planet had made its point and was now just maintaining pressure. "How long until they notice we've missed a check-in?" Poynal asked, his practical nature asserting itself even in crisis. 72 hours, Vex Kali replied. Standard protocol for geological surveys in low-risk zones. Low risk, Scrooge repeated, his laugh coming out as a strangled squawk. We classified this as low risk. 3 days without food processors, Poynal continued, his mind already calculating survival parameters. My people can manage on emergency rations, but the nutrient balance will be problematic. Vex Kali requires specific proteins. Scrooge's metabolism needs constant caloric input, or he'll start shutting down non-essential systems. I'm aware of my own biology, thank you. Crouch snapped, but his hearts weren't in it. He looked exhausted, his feathers drooping in the rain. Where's Thurmond? Vex Kali asked suddenly, her compound eyes scanning the outcropping. The human had been there a moment ago, and now he wasn't, which seemed like a concerning development, given that humans were supposed to be the fragile species that needed constant environmental support. They found him 10 minutes later, or rather, they heard him before they found him. The sound of stone scraping against stone echoed from somewhere below their position, accompanied by what might have been humming. Human humming. In a flood. During a crisis, Thurmond had moved to a flat section of rock, about 20 meters from their refuge, closer to the water, but still well above the flood line. He was dragging stones. Large stones, arranging them with the focused intensity of someone engaged in a project that made perfect sense to them and absolutely no sense to anyone watching. What? Vex Kali began, her mandibles working in confusion. Are you doing? Building a kitchen, Thurmond replied, not looking up from his work. He positioned another stone, tested its stability, nodded to himself, and went looking for more. A kitchen, Crouch repeated, his voice flat with disbelief. Our supplies are destroyed. Our equipment is floating away. We're stranded without communication, and you're building a kitchen. Yep. Why? Because people need to eat. Thurman straightened, wiping rain from his face with one hand while pointing at his growing construction with the other. The food processors are done, but food is food, just needs to be prepared differently. Prepared how? Poynal asked, his scientific curiosity overriding his confusion. With what equipment? Fire, rocks, water from the river once it settles, basic field cooking. He said this like it was obvious, like everyone should know how to prepare food using heated stones and optimism. You can't start a fire in the rain, Crouch objected, his tone suggesting he was arguing with someone who'd suffered head trauma. Combustion requires dry fuel. This is basic chemistry. Thurman smiled, which was somehow more concerning than if he'd agreed. You can't start a fire in the rain if you do it wrong. If you do it right, rain doesn't matter much. He continued arranging stones, building what was starting to look like a raised platform with a depression in the center. You three should find some shelter. This'll take a while. They retreated to an overhang in the rock face, watching as Thurmond worked with methodical precision. He built up the sides of his stone platform, creating walls that would block wind and provide a roof when he stretched salvaged tarp material across the top. He dug drainage channels with a folding shovel that had appeared from his apparently bottomless pack, directing water away from his workspace. He gathered logs from the tree line, selecting them with the careful consideration of someone who knew exactly what characteristics made wood useful. "He's insane," Crush muttered, huddled against the rock and shivering despite his down like feathers. "The stress has broken his mind." "Maybe," Poynall said, but his tone was thoughtful. "But look at the structure. He's creating a sheltered workspace with water management and ventilation. Whatever he's building, he's thought it through. He's thought through how to play with rocks during a flood." Vex-Kali corrected, but she was watching too, her antenna tracking Thurman's movements with reluctant fascination. The human worked for 2 hours straight, stopping only to drink water from a canteen and check his progress. The structure grew a raised platform to keep everything above potential water surges, stone walls to block wind, a clever arrangement of rocks in the center that formed a fire pit with a flat cooking surface. He waterproofed the covering using layers of tarp material and broad leaves, creating an actual roof. He even built a small entryway that would shed rain while allowing access. When he finally emerged and beckoned them over, they approached with the hesitant curiosity of scientists confronting an experiment that shouldn't work but might anyway. "Stone kitchen," Thurmond announced, gesturing at his creation with justified pride. "Weatherproof, raised above potential flood levels, ventilated for smoke management." "Now comes the fun part." "The fun part," Vex-Kali repeated, her voice suggesting she'd redefined the word fun to mean something involving hypothermia and misery. Thurmond knelt in the center of his structure and pulled items from his pack, a waterproof container holding matches that he'd apparently treated with some kind of sealant. Several blocks of compressed fire-starting material that looked like they'd been designed by someone who expected to need fire in terrible conditions, and strips of dry birch bark that he'd somehow kept completely moisture-free. "Fire starting in adverse conditions," he narrated, his tone taking on the character of someone who'd done this before and enjoyed it. "Step 1. Accept that everything is wet. Step 2. Work with what's dry. Step 3. Create more dry things." He arranged the fire starter blocks in a small pile, used the birch bark as kindling, and struck a match. The flame caught, improbably, impossibly, and actually stayed lit. He fed it carefully, adding small pieces of wood that had been sheltered by his platform, gradually building the fire larger. Smoke rose through the ventilation gaps he'd designed into the stone walls, drawn by convection and careful architecture. The three aliens watched a human make fire in the rain and found themselves without adequate words. "That's not possible," Crush whispered, but he was already moving closer to the warmth, his species' cold-blooded nature making the heat irresistible. "It's improbable," Poynall corrected, "but apparently not impossible." Thurmond was now moving through their scattered supplies, the ones that had washed partially up on rocks or snagged in vegetation. He picked through them with the practiced eye of someone conducting triage, separating items into categories: definitely ruined, probably salvageable, and surprisingly okay. The food processors were in Category 1, Most of their sealed rations were in Category 3. Your food processors broke because they got wet, Thurmond explained, arranging items on drying racks he'd improvised from metal framework and salvaged mesh. But food is food. These ration packs are vacuum sealed. They're fine. This dried protein powder got damp, but we can dry it out. These grain stores are edible if we cook them properly. Even the stuff that got partially waterlogged can be used if we're smart about it. He set up drying racks around the fire, using the heat and smoke to accelerate evaporation. He rotated items carefully, checking for spoilage, discarding anything that had genuinely spoiled. Within an hour, he had a working inventory, more than enough to feed everyone for 3 days, possibly longer if they were careful. Now, Thurmond announced, selecting ingredients with the confidence of someone about to attempt actual cooking. Let's make dinner. He built up the fire, arranged flat stones directly in the flames to heat, and began preparing food. For Vexkali, he created a high-protein paste using her species-specific powder mixed with water and heated on the hot stones until it achieved the proper consistency. For Pinal, he rehydrated algae supplements and combined them with grain porridge, adding minerals from the amphibian's supply kit. For Krur, he produced something approaching actual bread, using grain flour, water, and heat, baking it directly on the stones and supplementing it with high-calorie nut paste. For himself, he made something he called camp stew that looked questionable and smelled aggressively of spices. The aliens gathered around Thurman's stone kitchen, drawn by warmth and the undeniable fact that food was happening. The fire crackled. Steam rose from cooking surfaces. The rain continued outside, but inside the shelter, everything was dry and warm, and starting to smell legitimately good. "How do you know how to do this?" Vexkali asked, accepting her bowl of protein paste with mandibles that worked in confusion. The paste was the right temperature, the right consistency, even the right color. "Camping," Thurmond replied, tending to Krur's bread with attentive focus. "Humans do it for fun. Go out into wilderness areas, deliberately put ourselves in uncomfortable situations, practice survival skills." "For fun," Pinal repeated, tasting his algae porridge and finding it surprisingly palatable. "You voluntarily subject yourselves to scenarios like this one." "Well, usually there's less flooding and more planning. But yeah, basically. My family used to do it every summer. Dad taught me field cooking when I was 8. He flipped Krur's bread, checking for doneness. "The trick is understanding that primitive doesn't mean ineffective. Humans cooked food for thousands of years before we invented processors. The technology works." Krur took his bread with trembling talons and bit into it. His eyes widened. The bread was warm, properly cooked, and surprisingly edible. More than edible. It was actually good. "This is better than processed rations," he admitted, his voice small with surprise. "Fresh cooking usually is," Thurmond agreed, ladling out his own stew. "Processors are efficient, but they're not creative. This is food made for actual people, with actual taste preferences. Probably why humans never fully automated cooking, even after we figured out how." They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the diminishing rain outside. The meal was simple, but it was hot and filling, and represented the difference between surviving and suffering. Vexkali found herself relaxing for the first time since the flood, her mandibles working through the protein paste with genuine appetite. Poinal's gills fluttered contentedly. Crash ate 3 servings of bread and looked less like he was dying. "I still don't understand," Vexkali said eventually, setting down her empty bowl. "Your people have access to advanced food preparation technology. Why maintain these primitive skills?" Thurmond considered the question while feeding more wood to the fire. Because technology fails, equipment breaks, situations change, but knowing how to work with basic materials, basic physics, basic chemistry, that's universal. Fire is fire, heat is heat, food is food. Those don't change regardless of what planet you're on or what fancy equipment you have access to. Your species practices survival skills as recreation to maintain capabilities in case of emergency. Poynell asked, his scientific mind finding the pattern. That's remarkably pragmatic. Or remarkably paranoid, Crash added. But he was warm and fed, and his tone lacked any real criticism. Do all humans know these skills? Not all, Thurmond admitted. But enough of us do that it's kind of a cultural thing. We call it camping, hiking, backpacking, bushcraft. Different names for the same basic concept. Put yourself in an environment that requires problem solving and see what you can figure out. He smiled at their expressions. I know it sounds crazy. Most humans think it sounds crazy too. But then situations like this happen. And suddenly knowing how to build a fire in the rain seems less crazy and more useful. I'm adding a note to the expedition report, Vex Kali announced, her antenna twitching with what might have been amusement. Future multi-species teams should include at least one human with recreational survival experience, for insurance purposes. Make sure you mention the part where the human saved everyone by playing with rocks, Crash added, his chirping taking on a tone that might have been laughter. The Geological Survey Board will love that. The rain finally stopped around midnight, the clouds clearing to reveal Torith 9's 3 moons in various phases. The river had begun receding, leaving behind mud and debris and their scattered equipment. In the morning, they'd assess the damage properly, see what could be salvaged, and figure out their next steps. But for now, they were warm and dry, and fed, gathered around a fire, in a stone kitchen, built by a human who'd learned camping from his father. Thurmond kept the fire going through the night, maintaining watch while the others slept in shifts. He rotated drying equipment, checked on food supplies, and occasionally added wood to keep the flames steady. By dawn, the transformation was remarkable. Items that had seemed ruined were drying successfully. The camp, while scattered, looked survivable. Most importantly, everyone had made it through the crisis without injury. When Vex Kali emerged at first light, she found Thurmond already working. He'd expanded the drying operation, created an organized inventory system, and was in the process of cooking breakfast. The smell of toasting grain and heating protein supplements filled the morning air. Status? She asked, settling near the fire and accepting a bowl of morning rations. Better than expected, Thurmond reported, checking items on drying racks. The backup communicator from Crash's pod survived. I dried it out overnight, and it powered up about an hour ago. We can make our scheduled check-in. He gestured at the organized supplies. Food-wise, we have at least 10 days of full rations, possibly 14 if we're careful. Most of the analysis equipment is recoverable. 2 of the pods are functional once they dry out. We can continue the mission if you want. Vex Kali's compound eyes swiveled to take in the camp, the organized supplies, the functional kitchen, and the human who'd somehow transformed disaster into manageable inconvenience. You did all this overnight. Couldn't sleep anyway, Thurmond replied with a shrug. Seemed productive to use the time. Poynell and Craig joined them for breakfast, both looking considerably better than they had the previous day. They ate quickly, efficiently, their bodies responding to hot food and adequate rest. The meal was simple but satisfying, and when they'd finished, they began the work of properly assessing their situation. The backup communicator worked perfectly, and Vexcali reported their status to the orbital station: minor flooding, no injuries, mission continuing as planned. The station coordinator's response suggested they'd massively understated the severity of the situation, but Vexcali didn't correct them. What was she supposed to say? That they'd been completely unprepared for basic weather patterns and only survived because the human built a kitchen out of rocks? Actually, yes, that's exactly what she said in her official report. They spent the next 6 days completing their geological survey, operating out of Thurman's stone kitchen as their base of operations. The structure proved remarkably practical, serving as cooking area, equipment storage, and general meeting space. Thurmond maintained it with casual efficiency, adjusting drainage, improving ventilation, adding features as needed. By the end of the expedition, it looked less like an emergency shelter and more like a permanent installation. On their final day, as they packed equipment for extraction, Craig paused at the stone kitchen. "Seems wrong to just leave it," he observed, running his talons over the carefully arranged stones. "Someone put a lot of work into this. It'll be here if anyone needs it," Thurmond replied, performing a final check of the fire pit. "Maybe some future expedition will get flooded and find it useful." "Or maybe," Poynall suggested, his gills fluttering with amusement, "the geological survey will start including stone kitchen construction in their emergency preparedness training. Building fires in the rain, a human approach to disaster management," Vexcali added, her mandibles clicking in what her species used for laughter. "Required reading for all survey personnel." They left Torith 9 with their mission completed, their data collected, and their equipment mostly intact. The extraction shuttle pilot commented on their surprisingly good condition given the weather reports from the previous week. Vexcali simply stated they'd managed the situation and left it at that. Back at survey headquarters, Vexcali's report generated considerable discussion. The efficiency board wanted to know why humans weren't already assigned to all expeditions. The equipment division wanted to study Thurman's improvised solutions. The training department wanted to develop courses based on his techniques. Everyone agreed that recreational survival skills were apparently more valuable than anyone had previously considered. Thurmond himself accepted his commendation with characteristic understatement, mentioned that his father would be pleased to know camping had finally proven useful, and requested assignment to another survey team, preferably one going somewhere with interesting weather challenges. Because here's the thing about humans, that the rest of the galaxy was slowly, sometimes painfully, learning they'd evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill them for millions of years. Floods, fires, storms, droughts, temperature extremes, predators, diseases, and countless other hazards. And instead of developing advanced technology to avoid these problems, they'd developed advanced stubbornness to survive them. They'd learned to work with basic materials and basic principles, treating survival not as a last resort but as a fundamental skill set. And occasionally, when situations went sideways and equipment failed, and everyone was stranded by rising water, this meant that humans looked at a flooded campsite and saw an opportunity to build a kitchen. The geological survey updated their protocols. Future expeditions would include at least one team member with practical survival experience. Environmental hazard assessments would be conducted by multiple species, including humans who apparently had better instincts about weather patterns. Emergency supply kits would include basic fire-starting equipment alongside advanced technology. Some things, it turned out, were too important to leave to fancy equipment and confident assumptions. Sometimes survival came down to knowing how to stack rocks, start a fire, and turn disaster into dinner. And if that seemed primitive to species who'd bypassed such skills in their rush to technological sophistication, well, they were welcome to skip the camping trip. But when the river flooded their campsite, they'd better hope there was a human around who still remembered how to cook.